as disclosure. Okay, and now I'd like to introduce everybody online. There's a number of people online. I can't see how many people are in the audience with you there, Stephen, but welcome to those people too. And here's Stephen Hale from Torrens University, but soon I think to be of Adelaide University, going to give us a talk on rethinking economics for a well-being economy, which I think pretty much encapsulates this entire conference, doesn't it, in one title. So this is going to be great. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks everybody for listening to me, especially if you heard me trying to answer a question in the last hour. You probably had enough of listening to me already. I am an MNT economist. I work closely with one of Australia's leading ecological economists, Phil Lawn. I've spent most of my adult life training bankers, but so anybody has any questions about that, you can ask me about that later on if you like, but I hope I'm not evil or anything. I'm actually just about to leave the University of Adelaide after 20 years to try and set up a project which, if I don't go on for too long about, I hope to be able to say something to you about at the end of this presentation, with Torrens University, which is one of the 2 private universities in Australia. It has a campus in Brisbane, although its main centre is in Adelaide. Why a private university, you might ask? Basically, none of the public universities were interested, and Torrens has been very helpful and supportive. So Phil and I are going to be working on setting up courses and a research institute in the general area of economics and sustainability, with an emphasis on ecological economics and also on modern monetary theory, which I suppose is where I come in. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, just having a technical thing.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
Andrew, do you mind pinning our screen? I don't know.
We can see your screen perfectly well.
Okay, are we all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just try and figure out why we can't see.
We can probably, that's it.
What can we see?
If you click on the left-hand one, it'll hide the, yeah, that's it.
Okay, yep, so you can see us, but we can't see.
All right, thanks. Thank you very much. One reason why I am leaving Adelaide is because I've spent enough time being a token heterodox or non-orthodox economist in an orthodox economics department, and virtually all economics departments in Australia are very orthodox. Now, the terms orthodox economics and mainstream economics and neoclassical economics perhaps don't mean precisely the same thing, but they're close enough so that I'm going to use them as synonyms. It is my view that orthodox economics, which has dominated our profession and the political narrative in one way or another, really for at least 150 years, and a particularly pernicious form of it for the last 40 years, has always been a barrier to well-being, to social justice, to a less unequal society, and is now a barrier to ecological sustainability as well. And that's why I believe that if we are to rethink our societies so that we have in the future sustainable well-being economies, then we have to rethink the whole economics profession too, which I think is gradually happening actually, not as quickly as I would like. And that's partly because economists continue, as they always have, to have more power in policy discussions, in setting the agenda, in limiting the questions which it's acceptable for politicians even to ask, than most people imagine. The old economics is back to front about a lot of things. It's back to front in terms of our relationship with nature. It is founded on Enlightenment dualism, on the idea that you can separate people from nature, first of all, but also It's founded and has been for generations on the idea that the primary purpose, our higher purpose as a species, is to grow what, since the Second World War, we've called real GDP, to grow the economy in the interests of the elite, you might say. After all, 1% of the world population own more than half of the world's assets today, which I find is a very scary statistic. So whenever you hear politicians complain about, oh no, we don't have enough immigrants at the moment, there's not enough migration. I'm an immigrant to Australia, but they complain about the population's not growing. The economy won't grow if we don't grow the population. They never ask themselves, well, actually, if the population didn't grow, maybe we wouldn't need to grow the economy as much. And whenever, as you will see, Nobel Prize winning economists discuss issues like climate change and sustainability, it is always, without fail, in the context of the implications of a changing climate and mitigation measures for lost GDP. That's always what they focus on, hence the cartoon on the left-hand side. The book on the left-hand side is where this picture came from. And capitalism, which orthodox economics has always been in defense of. And of course, since the 18th century, we've had various different forms of capitalism. The economist Hyman Minsky said there's been as many forms of capitalism as Heinz have had types of pickles. And they've all been flawed, but to a different extent and in different ways. So, of course, the capitalism that we had in Australia in the 1950s and 60s is very different to that of the 2020s, but there's no denying it's been an enormous growth machine. I just took this chart from Our World in Data because I think it's rather arresting when you think about the impact on the planet of our expanding real GDP. This is inflation adjusted, this chart, or gross world product is another term for the same thing. When you remember that Earth system scientists say we have been living beyond our ecological resources since about 1970, and when you look at what's happened to the size of the economy since 1970, okay, we're only 60 or 70% beyond what Earth system scientists tell us would be sustainable in terms of our use of ecological resources. And after all, gross world product has multiplied by about 5 since 1970. So we have got better at producing goods and services with less ecological impact. We have got better, for that matter, at producing goods and services in terms of emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, dramatically so, down through the decades. But I am skeptical about the possibility of the world economy to continuing to grow in the future, even as it has over the last 30 years at a moderate rate of about 3% per annum. Because if you push that 100 years into the future, our economy would be 20 times as big as it is now. If you go slightly more than 200 years into the future, not even all the way back to Adam Smith time-wise, and it would be 1,000 times as big as it is now. And I just don't think that's possible. And one of the things that I've noticed about the COP talks, yet again, is that nobody on the inside of those talks with any significant influence has ever questioned the assumption that in 2100, our global economy would continue to be growing much the same way as it is at the moment. Why? Basically, because of the influence of orthodox or neoclassical economics on the way things we just take for granted. There is no doubt that the growth machine has done great things. Of course it has. It's lifted billions of people out of terrible poverty and want. There are many, many optimistic statistics about how things have got much better, which you could look up for yourself on the Our World in Data website. I won't worry about at the moment, but there's a couple of points I want to make with respect to this chart. Point number one, the increasing wealth of the richest countries in the world. It is possible, although not within neoclassical economics easily, to argue has to an extent been extracted from or stolen from, and it still is being extracted from the lowest income countries in our neo-colonial trading and global financial system, which we set up. And secondly, and I don't have time to explain this, I'm afraid, otherwise we'll be here all day, but it is my view that if we got distribution right, we could all be living an acceptably high quality of life in countries like Australia with about, and there is some evidence for this, about the same GDP per capita that countries like Estonia have now. We're beyond twice that level. So in a world where we are living beyond our ecological constraints, where we're doing much better at producing output per dollar with less impact on the environment than we ever did before, our continuing problem is that our economy is growing faster and us being more efficient in terms of ecological impact per dollar is able to keep up. And this is a question which is hardly being asked at all by policymakers as yet. The other thing which has been true of orthodox economics is that it's always been used as a justification for a relative lack of interest in issues of distribution, income and wealth distribution. Now, this isn't true of all neoclassical economists. There are neoclassical economists who do great empirical work, including, for that matter, on climate change and on distribution as well, but they do it despite the neoclassical blinkers and not because of them. And for many years, actually for a century, income distribution was a terrible area to go into if you wanted a good career in a university as an economist, because neoclassical economics, which was developed from the 1870s onwards, was developed in part deliberately to distract attention away from inequality and injustice, and as a reaction to the growing political influence of Marxist political economy in the latter part of the 19th century and the growing revolutionary movements in Europe. And just to illustrate this very quickly, in case you don't believe me, John Bates Clark was one of the founders of neoclassical economics. And I had to change the words slightly so they'd fit on the slide. But these are more or less words taken from his famous book on the distribution of wealth. I won't even read all the words on this slide, but basically the argument here is, if we can persuade everybody by constructing a model where this is a logical implication of the model, that everybody gets out of the economy what they put into it, that you get paid what you deserve, what your productivity is, that if you're not paid enough, then really you should have invested more in human capital, in education, or you should be motivated to work a bit harder now, or perhaps governments can do something if they just educate people better so that they're more productive and then they'll get paid more. Then the Marxist argument about exploitation and the argument for revolution disappears. Now, the foundations of modern orthodox economics were laid in the late 19th century, partly for this political purpose. Neoclassical economics was not a scientific advance. It was not based on empirical data. It was largely based on the need to counter Marxist political economy. So a neglect of distribution is one issue which we can blame orthodox economics for. And another issue, and I'm about to amaze you if you've never seen this before, is the failure to tackle climate change. How long have we been having the IPCC reports? How many of those COP conferences have there been? And yet emissions were at their highest ever level in 2019 and are growing again now. A large part of this is because until about 5 years ago, the IPCC reports, what finally came out, and the summary for policymakers was dominated by the world's leading neoclassical economists engaged in the issue of climate change. And who better to give us an example of this than the 2018 Nobel Prize winner, William Nordhaus, who got his Nobel Prize for the economics of climate change. Now, if this works, I'm going to show you about 20 seconds of William Nordhaus. Let's see whether it works.
So it shows you the economics of this. So the green.
Enough, William Nordhaus. Let me just say what he's about to go on and say. This is his Nobel Prize speech. So people cannot say that this is not an authority who has been very influential down the years. And it's not from decades ago. This is the 2018 Nobel Prize for Economics. What he's doing is imagining that it's possible to select a degree of global warming if only you can choose your optimal response in terms of our tax on carbon emissions, get the optimal tax right. And he's comparing. I mean, let's give him credit. Like me, he agrees that staying underneath 1.5 degrees is impossible. But he's then looking at various options. Staying under 2 degrees all the time, or on average across a 200-year period, or doing nothing at all. In 2018, he was predicting there would be eventually 6 degrees of global warming, if that happened. What he called optimal, and he did this by adding up in present value terms what he believed to be the future damage of climate change to GDP, remember? Because it's GDP that matters. And the cost to GDP of taking abatement measures meantime. Well, what he got as optimal was 4 degrees of global warming. Now, Earth system scientists like Will Stephan, the most famous Earth system scientist in Australia in recent years, will tell you that civilization will collapse if we have 4 degrees of global warming. More bizarre still, 6 degrees of global warming, which Johan Rockström will tell you is potentially an extinction event for our species. Everything will run away. The Nobel Prize winner, William Nordhaus, was actually better because it was cheaper than trying to keep global warming below 2 degrees. This is insane. It is literally insane. How did he get this result? He got this result by taking the cost of global warming, by comparing different places on the planet with different average temperatures, and saying on average, the countries with higher average temperatures have lower GDP. So that's how we're going to assess the impact of global warming, completely forgetting, of course, as thousands and thousands of scientists will tell you, that the weather and the climate are not the same thing at all. But there again, neoclassical economics has never been all that concerned with realism. It's not about realism. It's about whether you put your model together, in his case, and something called an integrated assessment model of climate change, using generally accepted methods and producing what people see as useful results. Now, I have talked to other neoclassical economists about Nordhaus's work, and Steve Keen, of course, has written extensively about it. And some of these guys come back and say, well, we put different assumptions into the model, and we get 2 degrees as the optimal global warming. Of course, that's the opposite of science. And you come back at them and you say, well, how come you gave this guy the Nobel Prize for economics 3 years ago? This is not in the 1970s or something. Things are changing. You could not have written what Jeremy Rudd wrote in a Federal Reserve working paper a couple of months ago, 10 years ago, and kept your job. Here is a footnote from a Federal Reserve, Washington, DC, working paper. Mainstream economics is replete with ideas that are actually arrant nonsense. Our place in the natural world, the view of that, as I've already mentioned, arrant nonsense. So we want a different approach, which we're just about to come to. Our higher purpose. Like Kate Raworth, I always say I'm agnostic about economic growth. I actually think GDP will have to increase in the next few years because we have to make lots of investments in green infrastructure, and that will count towards GDP. And you can't close things down until you've introduced things to replace them very often. But that, in my view, is arrant nonsense. I mentioned John Bates Clark. What neoclassical economics has always said about distribution is arrant nonsense. They also get, and here's where MMT comes into the story, money and the monetary system wrong. The neoclassical general equilibrium model that dates back to the 1870s, at its root, is actually a barter model. It is a pure barter model with no role for money and finance at all. And even the modern day versions of it, they call them dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models that central banks and treasuries continue to use, have the same roots. And when they put money and finance into these models, Well, you can never do it, even vaguely, realistically. I haven't got time to explain to you much about that, apart from, I can point out that including money and finance in these models never changes the equilibrium solution. So obviously there's no point putting money and finance in at all. And of course, this is why they're never able to forecast things like the global financial crisis, because in the neoclassical model, unless we get hit by a rock from outer space, or we have a terrible pandemic we don't control maybe, then an internally generated financial crisis is impossible. It can never happen. Now, they don't throw you a barter model in first year economics, but they tell you a historically incorrect, and we know it to be incorrect, story of the development of money. They say there used to be complex barter economies, but within those complex barter economies, people noticed that transaction costs for a variety of reasons were very high, so they weren't very efficient. So over time, people gradually got round to accepting a particular asset, often a precious metal like gold, as money, and that's where money came from. And you continue with the story that we don't have time to continue with, and eventually you get to 2021 and fiat money and all that. Now we know, because archaeologists and anthropologists and historians of money differ on many things, but they never differ on this point. We know that money never emerged from a pre-existing barter system ever, even once, anywhere in the world in human history. And it's more complicated than I'm about to imply, but it's nearer the truth to say that what some of us heard in the previous hour is correct. That in the Middle East, early forms of government developed taxation, and the monetary unit was the unit of account that those early forms of government used in order to assess how much taxation or tribute conquered peoples would have to give them in order to continue to have their liberty. In other words, the emergence of money was related to the introduction of taxation and early forms of government. Governments invented money. Money did not emerge in the private sector, and fiat money did not start in 1971. It's actually gone in and out of practice. David Graeber's book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, is a really good story of this. But the first fiat money, as John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, said in chapter 1 of his treatise on money in 1930, he said it was more than 4,000 years old. David Graeber would have said it was more than 5,000 years old. Governments invented money, and it is certainly the case with modern monetary systems that central banks and the currency issuing governments that are set above them are still at the heart of our monetary system now. So we need to make some changes. First of all, our relationship with nature and our higher purpose. Orthodox economics gets wrong, and we need to challenge this, and we need to keep challenging it even when it appears rude, as it sometimes does. Of course, we are not separate from the planet. You and I both know this. We are part of nature. And the economy, our labor, our skills, our capital equipment, our technology, our infrastructural capacity, our natural resources, our land, and our ecological capacity for that matter, are available to meet the needs of our community. And like First Nations people, we should be thinking 7 generations ahead. So our view of community should stretch in time as well as in space. And this is the right way of thinking about our higher purpose. The economy is there for our benefit, not the other way around. And if we don't need to grow the economy, or if it's not efficient because the costs to us, however you want to think of them, exceed the benefits of growing the economy, then we don't need to grow the economy. It certainly shouldn't be our objective. Growth in GDP is at best a means to an end. It's never an end in itself. I'm not going to spend more than a couple of seconds on this because you've all seen this diagram from Kate's fantastic game-changing book. Almost everybody else has shown this graph. What we haven't seen is Kate's friends at the University of Leeds applying Kate's model to 150 countries around the world, which is worth spending a few moments on, because what they did, as far as you you can do so. The need to be able to get statistics which are comparable internationally means their biophysical boundaries were not exactly the same as the 9 that Johann Rockstrom identified, and their social thresholds were not precisely the same as the social foundations in Kate's diagram, but close. The important point is that these ecological economists at Leeds have shown us that there are no developed countries. To be a developed country, you need to be meeting most, if not all, of the social thresholds for most, if not all, of your inhabitants to be able to live a decent life. And you need to be crossing few, if any, of our biophysical boundaries. There are countries that don't cross the biophysical boundaries, that live sustainably, but that live with a very low standard of living, that don't meet the social thresholds. There are countries where most people have a low standard of living, and yet they breach the biophysical boundaries anyway. There are countries like Australia, where the only one of these social thresholds that we don't qualify to meet is inequality. We're too unequal, according to the Leeds ecological economists for that. But all the other ones, the way they define them, we pass, but of course we are far beyond our biophysical boundaries. So that's our problem. I think this chart is important because this is the problem for the next generation, for the next century. Every country needs to somehow be in that top left-hand corner. That's not to say that you can't define social thresholds or biophysical boundaries differently to the way they do it at the University of Leeds, but it is to say that that is our job if we're to say we're a genuinely developed country. So I never distinguish between developed and developing countries anymore, because there is no such distinction, because there is no developed country. Now back to MMT. That's our problem. We've not cracked the problem yet, neither has anyone else. Finding the dollars isn't the problem. As we heard from Jason in the last hour, quite correctly, our government is not only a currency issuer, but a fully monetary sovereign currency issuer. We have a floating exchange rate. The federal government, trust me, it has no foreign currency denominated debt. That doesn't mean foreigners don't own treasury bonds. They're allowed to do that, but it does mean the repayments are in Australian dollars. And we have a rich and flexible economy. So the other issue about fluctuations in exchange rates, well, don't you remember how low the Aussie dollar was in 2001? We didn't have hyperinflation. We are not in the position a lot of low-income countries are, where we're very vulnerable to movements in exchange rates. A blessing as far as we're concerned. Taxpayers need the government's money. It's not the other way around. The government needs us to need its money, and that's why Jason was talking about taxation and obligation. And it doesn't matter whether we use local currencies or cryptocurrencies, if possible, to organise our transactions, as long as the federal government says, no, 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 you need some Australian dollars at tax time. There'll always be a demand for Australian dollars. So the Australian federal government has no purely financial, note the purely financial, constraints. What's more, when people talk about deficits and surpluses, even cartoonists in the Australian newspaper get things completely the wrong way around more often than not. The government's deficit is our surplus, and the government's net debt is not a debt in the conventional sense at all. If you spend your own currency into circulation, you can't really borrow your own currency. And as I was saying before, that's not the purpose in our monetary system of issuing treasury bonds in the first place. The net debt of the government, I like to call it the net money supply, because it's money that you and I have that we in the private sector have not had to borrow into existence, so don't have to repay ourselves. The government's debt is not our debt. The currency issuer could afford to buy anything which is for sale in its currency. And just to point out how they get things wrong, before the pandemic, if you remember, after years of austerity, the government was on the brink of being able to claim the prize of having a budget surplus. The Howard surplus, by the way, trebled private sector debt. That's how they managed to have a surplus in the early 2000s. But here we go. Josh Frydenberg, his surplus, he'll be raining down dollars on the population. No, it's the other way around. A government surplus is when they take more dollars from us than they give us. It's a giant vacuum cleaner for dollars. Actually, of course, the pandemic struck, and then that's exactly what Josh Frydenberg did. Rain dollars down on the population, not from a surplus quiver, because actually it doesn't matter what the accounting record is of the government's account with the RBA. If there's zero in it, if there's $1 trillion in it, our government as the currency issue has the same ability to spend. So finding dollars is not the problem. And by the way, it is not the job of the government to balance its budget over time either. People sometimes like a chart. The IMF looks at sectoral balances, the government balance, the private sector balance, and the balance of the rest of the world, the foreign balance on our monetary system every year. They do this for 39 high-income countries. I thought let's average it across a lot of countries so you can see what's typical. The blue is the private sector. The blue is always positive all the way back to 1990. What does that tell you? It tells you that in high-income countries, on average, the private sector net saves nearly all the time. How do they net save? Where do the dollars come from? Not from others in the private sector borrowing, otherwise it wouldn't be net saving. From the government. On average, for the last 30 years, high-income countries have run budget deficits every single year. Australia, with its Howard government budget surpluses, made possible by the private sector going vastly into debt, trebling our household debt, giving us a property market bubble. We're an unusual case. This is not typical, and it's not normal either. It is normal for the government to deficit spend because it is normal for the private sector to accumulate net savings in dollars. That's just the way that's how monetary systems work. So the government has no financial constraints, but that doesn't mean there's no constraints, as we were hearing in the last hour. All economies have limited stocks of labor, skills, capital, technology, institutional capacity, natural resources, as we were saying before. And yes, we have ecological constraints, but of course they don't bite us for a few decades. So they're not the obvious ones. But the important thing where federal spending is concerned is what you spend it on. ScoMo is not going to run out of dollars. And we do need to be making investments. I'm not going to use your time up by talking about the range of investments in order to create the infrastructure for a circular, regenerative, well-being economy. We've been hearing about some of those actually over the last couple of days. But finding the dollars isn't the problem. It's not finding the dollars, it's finding the real resources. That's what you have to plan for. If you want to build high-speed rail from Brisbane all the way down to Melbourne, where are the materials coming from? Where are the workers? Have they got the skills? Are they in short supply? Will you be competing against the private sector when there's already full employment and driving inflation? If so, maybe you can't do it now, or maybe you need to do it more slowly, or maybe you need to change the way you regulate the banking system to limit mortgage lending, to cool off the private housing market a bit, to have the construction workers available, or maybe you need to train more people. Those are the issues. What you can technologically do, you can always pay for. But where capacity is limited, then if you don't want your spending to be inflationary, you will have to find pay-fors. I just spoke about some pay-fors, and I didn't mention taxation yet at all. But that's one possible pay-for, of course it is. The macroeconomic role of taxation is to limit the ability of the private sector to spend, to create room within the productive capacity of the economy for the government to do the investments we need the government to do. But it's only one possible approach to this. But we should never, ever, whether we're talking about a UBI or a job guarantee or whatever investments you're talking about in healthcare, in education, in whatever, can we afford it is the wrong question. Can we resource it? That's the right question. It's about real things. Now, why have people always pretended otherwise? Here is another Nobel Prize winner. Just a few seconds again, Paul Samuelson, actually, the second Nobel Prize winning economist. Why do governments of fiat monetary systems like ours pretend that they're going to run out of money.
And one of the functions of old-fashioned religion was to scare people by sometimes what might be regarded as myths into behaving in a way that long-run civilized life requires.
We want to be forced into privatizing industries so that our mates can buy up what we're privatizing and make some money. And when we're not politicians anymore, we can get jobs in those companies. We want to be able to say we can't afford to take effective action as far as climate change is concerned because it's too costly for the economy. We want smaller government with less regulations. So if we're going to tax people less because we're going to argue that that's necessary to get so-called high achievers to be well motivated, then we'll privatize, we'll have a smaller government, we'll have a less equal society, and we can scare people into accepting that there's no alternative to going along with a civilized way of thinking about the world. What if you wanted to take the genuine problem, which is creating a well-being economy while living within our ecological frontiers seriously? First of all, you need to say, we will no longer ever target GDP growth. We'll measure it, a measure of the money spent on goods and services produced in the economy every year, but it'll be a footnote to our national accounts. It's not the main issue. Now, we heard about the Australian National Development Index, I think, over the last couple of days, which sounded great to me. But I do sometimes wonder whether we are wasting time a little bit reinventing the wheel, because Herman Daly, that some of you have heard of, and others, developed something which eventually became known as the Genuine Progress Indicator decades ago. We already have it. It's even more subjective than GDP in terms of how you put it together, how you measure it. So we could do with a big international conference to standardize how the GPI is measured so that it ends up perhaps playing the same role in terms of guiding policymakers in the future as GDP has in the past. But we don't need to completely reinvent a measure of well-being. In itself, maximizing your GPI does not guarantee sustainability. So we need to be looking at Kate's panel of indicators as well, not so much the sustainable development goals, because economic growth is one of those. And we've said we're not sure whether that's ecologically sustainable or not, but most of the rest of them, sure. What is the GPI supposed to be? Well, it looks at a range of economic and environmental and social issues. What it tries to do is to identify in dollar terms so that you could compare it with the GDP if you wanted to. You need some scale to do this on. The costs as well as the benefits of economic activity, so that you deduct the costs from the benefits. And if you have reached the point, as we probably have reached in most high-income countries, where the GPI curve has stopped sloping up and is starting to slope down, as you expand the scale of the economy, you need to be focusing on those indicators that you've chosen to include in the GPI, which you think are important for ecological sustainability and social well-being. And you need to be trying to shift that curve. You need to be trying to increase the Genuine Progress Indicator, not increase the GDP anymore. Respect the science and play it safe. We are on the brink of doing that now. Fewer people are listening to Nobel Prize-winning economists like William Nordhaus. Don't try and identify an optimal tax to have an optimal degree of global warming. When the scientists say anything beyond 2 degrees is potentially catastrophic, you better make sure whatever else you do, you talk to your engineers and your scientists and you organize yourselves internationally not to go beyond 2 degrees of global warming. Who cares about GDP in that context? I mean, you know, if we're threatening the collapse of civilization, I don't really care how much GDP falls. It's not really an issue. Economists should be, sure, involved in financing the investments you need to make in a way which is not inflationary, involved in organising the transition appropriately, but nobody should ask an economist what's the optimal degree of global warming. It is not their business. It's not up to them, it's up to the natural scientists. Use the power of the public purse to make the investments you need as fast as your resources will allow. Use markets as a tool and not a master. This is what Herman Daly would say again. If you need to live within your carbon budget, then by all means allocate or auction licenses, permits to generate carbon emissions. Then by all means let people trade those permits. That's a market. But the market should play no role in setting the quantity. That's the important thing. Shape the future, as Mariana Mazzucato was saying earlier this year in a book called The Mission Economy. Make it sustainable and equitable nationally and internationally. Treat economic activity as a means to an end, and that end or higher purpose is the well-being of the present and future generations, married within the well-being of our environment, because we are part of our environment. Now, what are we doing about this? We've been running summer school weekends. We've done 3 in Adelaide in 2021 with more than 200 activists coming to those events, and we've covered a range of issues. You know, I start with ecological economics. I am an MMT economist, but we don't start with MMT. It's the wrong place to start. We start with the ecological constraints. And this is what we cover on these courses. We hope to do one in Brisbane at some point this year. And the other thing we're doing, as I said at the very beginning of the talk, is with my great friend Phil Lawn, who to me is Australia's leading ecological economist and has spoken at events like this in the past, and is closely associated with the GPI. That's Phil on the left-hand side there. And with the support of Torrens University, we are intending to set up next year a Centre for Sustainable Prosperity at that university, the main business of which will be to offer training to activists, yes, but we want to give people places to get master's degrees and doctorates, which allow them to investigate MMT in the monetary system for sure, but also allow them to investigate ecological issues. And we particularly want to promote the GPI, or a version of the GPI. We're going to do it via online courses almost entirely because we're in Adelaide and there are not many people there, but also because this isn't just unique to Australia. If we can pull it off, this is unique to the planet. There is no university offering MMT and ecological economics under the same roof. So that's what we're going to try and do. We had the very close support of Stephanie Kelton, who wrote The Deficit Myth, the world's biggest selling economics book in the last 2 years. Gabie, who is sitting in the room with me, is the organizer of Modern Money Lab. These other people here, Fadel Kaboub is another American academic who's an ecological economist and an MMT economist. The other 3, they are from banking, because we need help with funding, and from academia. And that's what we plan to do. And that's what, as I get towards 60 years of age, that's what I want to do with the rest of my life. Phil is a great researcher. I want him to do loads of research in ecological economics and develop the GPI. I am more of a teacher. I want to teach a different type of economist. And I'm glad to say there is interest from banks and state and federal governments. There are jobs now for people with a heterodox background. We just don't have anywhere in Australia to train them at the moment. That's what we're going to try and do. And I've gone on far too long, but that's the end. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a fantastic presentation, bringing together 3 of my favorite economists in the last few years, Stephanie Kelton, Maria Mazzucato, and Kate Raworth. Is it coincidence that the most revolutionary economics writers are all women in the last few years? Maybe not. That was a really great talk, and I'll be personally looking out for your events in Brisbane. I'm very, very interested in that. I can't see the room, so I don't know whether there's questions in the room. There are no direct questions in the chat box. If anyone's got questions, direct questions for Stephen, please.
There is a question in a question in the room.
Excellent.
As I take the microphone across, I ought to say one of the leading MMT economists is not far from here, is Bill Mitchell at Newcastle. It would be remiss of me not to have mentioned Bill.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for your spectacular talk. I was talking to you before about it, but I wanted to know your views on MMT, and I don't know if you were here for the first session on Friday about green prints and AILA and their model of that version of ecological limits, and also the donut, and how you think that they might come together at some stage, or if it's possible. Just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Okay, you've put me in trouble now, because I know that Stephanie and Kate are working with each other, but I'm not allowed to tell anyone. What I've just told you now, there's not that many people listening, so we're okay. I think I tried to tie the two things together a little bit in the talk. Kate is not negative about MMT at all. It's not her area of expertise particularly. Stephanie writes to me because Phil isn't on social media, so I sort of act as a go-between, on Twitter on a regular basis, and is fascinated about ecological economics, which probably 10 years ago she wouldn't have known anything about. So those two areas are moving together very quickly. And Jason Hickel, the anthropologist, who is much more of a degrowther than Kate. Actually, Kate will tell you that she's agnostic about economic growth, which is what I always say, agnostic but skeptical. I think economies will have to grow in the next 5 or 10 years, but I don't think they'll be growing in the year 2100. But Jason understands MMT very well. And as Gabie was saying a little bit earlier, he's written articles on it too. So but that's been for more than 10 years. Phil and I, in our little way, very little for me, have been trying to pull the two sides together. Phil will go to ecological economics conferences and talk about MMT, and I go to MMT conferences and talk about ecological economics. That's what we've been trying to do, and the gap between them is shrinking. And those people who are not moving as fast as the others tend to be people who are even older than me. So amongst younger people, there's a much closer relationship between the two. That's, as I said, what we want to try and encourage in the next few years. If people as relatively unimportant as us can have a legacy at all, that's what we want. We want to stop doing this by the time we're 70, so we've got 10 years. We want to leave something behind. What I'd like is a model for how to do this, which the public universities will then copy. We don't mind being made redundant. We don't mind being outmoded when universities like this one are doing degrees and postgraduate qualifications in ecological economics and modern monetary theory. That's what the campaign is, basically. We all have to do our bit. So you talk about green prints. I wasn't here on Friday, but I have seen that being spoken about since, and it was fascinating. It was also fascinating to hear about regen, Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane. And I'm going to be talking when I get back to a scientist, natural scientist at the University of Adelaide, about a regen Adelaide as well. And it's interesting also to hear about sustainable smaller communities too. But what I think is we have a set of problems which is so massive that we mustn't be fighting each other. So we're like, think of a sports team. That's a good analogy. I'm a soccer fan. If you play soccer, everybody doesn't have to be centre forward. And if I'm going to be the goalkeeper or the right back, that's absolutely fine. We're all pushing in the same direction, but we're all doing it in a different, but not contradicting each other way. And I think that's marvelous. It's been a great privilege to be here. I felt a bit guilty flying over, but as I said, we had to come over anyway because for the Torrens project. So it's been marvelous. This university is fantastic. This space is fantastic. The presentations have been fantastic, those that I've seen. And I would like to thank the organisers, and I would like to do something I didn't do at the beginning, which is also pay my respects to the Turrbal and Yangara people on whose land we are standing, and the whole conference has taken place. So it's been a great pleasure to be here, if there's no other questions. But if there are, I'm happy to answer them.
I have one in the chat, Stephen, from the gentleman that spoke before you, Jason Van Tol. It's a long question, so I'll let Jason take himself off mute and ask it directly.
Oh, great. Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Stephen, for that presentation. I missed a little bit near the beginning, but I can't tell you how excited I am to hear that you're doing this and you're joining MMT and ecological economics together. As I mentioned during my talk, I was kind of surprised actually that many people in the MMT camp were quite dismissive of ecological economics. But anyway, that's fantastic that you're doing it. Full support to you. I think it's really exciting. The question that I wanted to ask you though had to do with just when you talked about saying that, you believe that we do need to have some economic growth. Over the last year or maybe two, from a pointer from Michael Hudson, I got familiar with Jacob Assa's work. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but he's proposed a new metric called final GDP or FGDP, which nets out the financial component of GDP, which has been added to the NEPA since, as far as I understand it, 1993, and then expanded again in the changes made to the NEPA in 2008. And he actually has, he's written a book on it and shown how, especially in countries like the UK and the United States in particular, these are highly financialized economies. And so a big part of what counts now as growth is actually, because of the changes that have been made, are actually due to financial fees. And as far as I understand it too, in some cases, debt servicing payments, interest payments as well, that also counts as a production as well. So I just wondered if you could comment on how well the standard GDP metric as it now stands can be used to gauge the sort of economic growth that you think, or that we all think perhaps will be needed when so much of what the GDP now counts as growth is polluted, if you like, by this financialization of the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know about the US, so I'm sure what you said is right. In the UK, it was about 1970 that net interest income of financial institutions and some other fees were first introduced in GDP. Prior to that, they were treated as transfer payments, not as part of gross domestic product. It's certainly the case that after that change, which was pushed for by the financial institutions themselves, it influences. This is one reason for focusing on something like the GPI, because politicians were much more interested in growing finance when finance counted as part of GDP, which it almost didn't before the early 1970s. And what you said, I think, probably applies to the US. As I said, I don't know the details as far as the US is concerned. I wasn't talking about wanting to grow GDP. And certainly, I think it's about 13% of GDP, which is finance related in Australia. Most, not all of that, but most of that, or much of it anyway, is unproductive, doesn't actually help anything, and in fact just inflates asset markets. I was simply saying, from a pragmatic point of view, if we want to insulate homes, if we want to put lots of solar panels on lots of buildings, if we want to resource our healthcare sector and our education sector better. For that matter, if you wanted to have a UBI, because that wouldn't count as part of GDP, but people would obviously, especially those people that needed it, they'd spend more, inevitably. That's what I meant, inevitably. Some of the things we want to do would increase GDP. And if, for example, you want to reduce car ownership, I'm not someone that believes that electric cars are going to be the solution to all of our problems, then you need brilliant public transport. But the trouble is you need the brilliant public transport before you start discouraging as much car ownership. You can't do it the other way around. And so consequently, while you're doing the first half of that, gross domestic product is inevitably going to increase, but it should never be, it's just a means to an end. All you're doing there is recording the spending you're doing, and it will increase GDP. It's not an aim. And in terms of GDP being a measure of well-being, as I think you said in the last hour, you mentioned Simon Kuznets. Simon Kuznets, who invented GDP pretty much, always said it wasn't a measure of well-being. It was never intended to be a measure of well-being. It's just a measure with some subjective odds and ends on the fringes of it, of the total amount of spending of the goods and services produced in the economy in a year. And of course, if we have terrible natural disasters as a result of climate change, and the government spends a lot of money helping people rebuild, that's defensive spending. It would have been better not to cause the natural disasters in the first place. It's a bit funny saying that well-being's gone up because GDP's gone up, but gross domestic product would increase if spending went up under those circumstances. And of course, that'd be quite right, because that's what GDP is supposed to do. Measure the total amount of spending taking place in the economy. If we have a bigger prison population, it'll cost more. Go on. Oh, thank you. We'll spend more on it. Who has the world's biggest prison population? The US does. Far bigger than China's prison population, despite its much lower overall population. So they spend a fortune on running the prisons, much of which is in the private sector. It counts as part of GDP. It's not exactly a measure of well-being. If an oil tanker starts to leak oil and we have to clear up all the oil, or do our best to clear up all the oil, that will increase GDP too. But again, it's a defensive measure. So one of the points of the genuine progress indicator is that a lot of the costs of economic activity are either ignored by GDP or they're actually added to GDP. They should be deducted from a measure of well-being, and they're added to what governments around the world focus on. Last thing I say, again, relating back to Jason in the last hour, when the Australian government says our economy was growing for 25 years, they mean GDP was growing for 25 years. They certainly don't mean well-being of the great mass of the population was. But thank you very much. Okay, I went on too long, sorry.
I just wanted to give you a quote from Jonathan Rowe. A GDP hero is a chain-smoking terminal cancer patient driving to divorce court.
Exactly right. Yeah, absolutely, and exactly right. And some of those things specifically are addressed in the genuine progress indicator. Actually, we need a different metric. I do think we need a single statistic, because our politicians, like me in a lot of ways, are not always all that bright. And when you just offer them a huge panel of indicators and say, come up with a budget based on that, they'll go back to GDP, unless you've got something else simple for them to focus on. And if it's something simple that points them in roughly the right direction as far as policies are concerned, then I think that's worth getting behind. And I think Phil, best Australian mate of mine though he is, I think his work on the genuine progress indicator is genuinely important. And it is my dream to have him standing in front of the United Nations or something like that, talking about the need for a global agreement on a standardized way of coming up with an albeit imperfect and subjective measure of well-being, but one we can agree on, which will encourage decisions which promote sustainability and a well-being economy, not just here, but in all those 150 countries that the University of Leeds were reporting on. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. And I wonder how future evolutions of the Sustainable Development Goals might be able to assist there. I know there's been a lot of work in how certain economic metrics, such as the system for environmental accounting, economic accounting, is feeding into SDG. Thank you, Stephen. That's the end of the penultimate session of the NENA conference. Afternoon tea, I think, beckons for you now, and reconvene the last session. Thank you, everybody.
Andrew, one quick question. I don't know if you can still hear me. I was just wondering, just super quick question. I wonder if Stephen can link us to Phil's latest work on the GPI. I'd be quite interested to see that, especially since he was promoting it so much. Maybe I just send him a private email. I don't know if you can.
Potentially, if Stephen's still there, maybe is Stephen still there?
Yeah, we'll put a link in the chat now, Jason, for you. They're going to put a link in the chat.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you, Jason.
Nice meeting you too, Andrew.
Cheers.
Is everyone okay to end the call now? Everyone got all the links and stuff like that they needed?
Yeah, I've got it. Thank
Okay, no worries. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Phil would be very interested to talk to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wish you luck on that. That's great. Thanks.